In this video, I'm going to show you how I make snare drums inside of Native Instruments Massive. Here's an example of the snare sound that I'm going to make. This snare drum is suitable for electronic genres of music, specifically drum and bass and dubstep, but you can use it in any genre you like. So, the first thing we got to do before we start making the sound is we need to analyze what a snare is and what it sounds like. So I've got two snare samples here. And they're both the kind of typical 200, 250 hertz punchy snare that you hear in a lot of electronic music. There are three parts to a snare drum: the transient, the body, and the tail. The transient is the initial snap or click that you hear, and it's what provides a lot of the punch, and it's typically the loudest part of the snare drum. The second part of the snare is the body, which is the low end thud or thump, and the third part is the tail, which is what gives the snare its character. So I can divide this sample up into its three parts, like so. So here I have the three parts. This is the transient of the snare, the body, and the tail. I could do the same with this sample. The transient ends around there. The body ends around there. And the rest is the tail. Here's the transient, the body, and the tail. So these snares are the kind of sound that we're going to be aiming for when we're synthesizing our snare, and we're going to use a mixture of synthesis and resampling to make our snare drum. So the first thing is to create a new instance of Massive in stereo. And the first thing I always do when I open Massive is I go File, New Sound, because that initializes everything and it clears all the settings. So first of all, let's make our transient sound. I find that square waves and saw waves work best because they have a lot of harmonics that you can use to create a punchy sound. But you can experiment because Massive has lots of wavetables. I just find that squares and saws work best. Now, one very important thing is to turn on restart via gate, because this means that the oscillator will start from the same phase position every single time it plays, which means you'll get a more consistent sound, which is what you want for drums. And if you set the phase position of oscillator 1 to 90, that means it will start at its the waveform will start at a peak in its cycle, which is essentially the loudest part of the waveform, and that is what you want in a drum. You want the loudest part to be at the very beginning. So once you've done that, go to envelope 4 and bring the attack down to the minimum. And then what I like to do is I like to use a performer to modulate the amplitude of oscillator 1, and you could use an envelope for this, but I prefer to use a performer because I use all four of the envelopes for other purposes in this patch. Now what I do is I turn up the X-ray sequence to the max, and I draw in a shape that looks like this. And this is going to be my volume envelope for oscillator 1. So I turn up the rate quite fast and I have a listen. So at the moment it's very short, poppy sound, but it doesn't have a lot of punch. So to get that punch, I use envelope 1 and I drag it onto the pitch of oscillator 1 and I take it up 64 semitones and I draw in a shape that looks like this in envelope 1. Short attack, no level, bring the decay down to get this sound. And I'm going to turn up the master out. So now we have a sound that has quite a lot of punch. It has some upper harmonics, and you can remove some of those harmonics by increasing the rate of your performer. Or if you want more harmonics, you could just bring the rate down. Now then, the next part of the snare is the body, and sine waves and triangle waves work best for this, so I'm going to use halfway between the two. So I've got a sine wave combined with a triangle wave, and I'm going to use envelope 2 to modulate the amplitude of oscillator 2. I'm going to draw in a shape that looks like this. No level, very short decay, immediate attack, and a little bit of delay. And what the delay does is it stops the oscillator from playing for a very short length of time, which gives oscillator 1, which is the transient oscillator, more time, because I'll demonstrate, if we have the delay set to 0, you'll hear both the oscillators play at exactly the same time, which kind of gives a kind of messy result, and the snare doesn't sound as clear compared to if you delay oscillator 2 a tiny bit. Because then they're not conflicting so much, and the transient comes through clearer. And you can choose to use a square for your transients, because sometimes I find it works better than a saw wave. But for the purpose of this video, I'm going to have an equal balance of both by putting my wavetable position in the center. Now we're going to make the final part of the snare, which is the tail, and for that I'm going to use envelope 3 to modulate the amplitude of the noise oscillator, and I'm going to draw in a shape that looks like this. No level, once again, relatively short decay, and a kind of slow attack. And I'm going to bring the colour down just a bit, because when the colour is on max, the noise is very bright, and you don't always want that because it can be a bit ear piercing. So I'm just going to bring it down just a little bit and have a listen. Now that sounds alright, but you can play around with the attack time to find a sound that you like. Alternatively, you can have the attack set to 0. It's just, well, the result isn't really that desirable in my opinion. I personally think it sounds better if you use a slow attack on the noise. Alright, so in the way of oscillators, that's more or less it. Now we move on to effects, and the first effect I'm going to use is distortion. Now in Massive you have 3 choices for distortion, and I like to think they're in order of extremeness, because the classic tube is less extreme, and the Brauner tube is very extreme. So I'm going to start by selecting classic tube. And what this does is it basically makes the whole snare sound fatter and fuller, and it also introduces some new low frequencies. I'm going to use it with discretion, however. Now the second effects I'm going to use is reverb, and this is going to add some stereo width. I'm going to use a very small size and a low dry wet level. And then bring the density down, turn the color up a bit. Bring the master down just so you don't clip. Now what the density does is it, well, when you have it turned up, you're not filtering the low end, but when you turn it down, you have less of the low end rumble. And I don't really want a lot of low end rumble in this snare, so I'm going to bring it down just a little, and the color just makes the reverb a bit brighter. Now I'm going to use Massive's built-in EQ to shape the snare drum, and the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to cut a lot of the mids out, because if we look at our snare sample, which I will drag in again, and the second one, and let's open up the channel EQ. You can see that there's not a whole lot happening in the mid frequencies from around 300 to 1000. There's a big cut at around 450 hertz, and if we look at our second snare sample, it's a similar kind of story. There's a big dip at around 500 hertz. So if we come back to our synthesized snare and we open up channel EQ, I'm just going to cut a lot of the mid frequencies and sweep the frequency knob until I find an area that I like. And then I'm going to bring the boost back up so that I'm not cutting out all of the mids, because I want to leave a small amount in. And I want to be aiming for around 500 hertz here. So that's not too bad. Now what I'm going to do is boost the low shelf, which is going to increase the level of the fundamental frequency. And I'm going to boost the high shelf just to make the whole snare a bit brighter. And I'm going to bring the master down, because we were clipping a bit there. Now, so in terms of synthesis, that's more or less it. You can choose to further, push your snare sound by using one of the inserts down here. Parabolic shaper works sometimes. It's helpful if you want a more kind of forceful, distorted snare sound. I'm going to use it a very small amount. So now that we finished synthesizing our snare, we're going to add a bit of processing. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the stereo field and which parts are more stereo than others. So to do that, I'm going to go back to my two samples, and I'm going to turn on the analyzer in the channel EQ, and I'm going to change the processing mode to side only. Now, if we have a look at this, the low end, there is a bit of stereo information here, but it's mostly mono. There's more stereo stuff happening in the high frequencies. So I'm going to make my fundamental frequency mono. So to do that, I'm going to go back to my snare and open up the channel EQ, change the processing to side only, and use a high pass to about 250 hertz. Turn on the analyzer, and now the fundamental is much more mono. And if you choose to, you can boost the high frequencies to make them more stereo. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use some compression on the snare to make it punchier. I find that the Studio VCA circuit works best on drums, but that's just a personal preference. Now, when compressing, I like to bring the attack and release down to the minimum, the ratio up to the max, and bring the threshold all the way down. And then I'm just going to play the sound and gradually bring up the attack time until I hear the transient pop through, and that's how I know that I got the attack time right. And then I set the attack time to around between 30 and 40, release rather, and then I bring the ratio down to around 4:1, that's a good starting point, and the threshold to around -20. And once I've done that, I'm going to use another channel EQ to further shape my sound. Now, we did EQ the snare inside of Massive, but the only problem with Massive's built-in EQ is it's not very accurate and you haven't got that many options. So I'm going to use Logic's channel EQ to filter out the low end, because you don't really need that in a snare. So I'm going to cut up to 100 hertz, and then I'm going to use a small boost on the fundamental, just to make it pop through a bit more. And then I'm going to make a smallish cut at around 500, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to boost at between 1k and 2k, because that's where that kind of vocally breathy sound comes from that you hear in some snare drums, which can be desirable. So and next I'm going to boost between 5 and 6k, because that is where you kind of get that crashy, crisper sound, which can also be desirable. And this snare that we've made is particularly dull, so it does help to make it a bit brighter. And then finally, for EQ, I'm going to use a very subtle low pass, just to remove those very high ear fatiguing frequencies that can be a bit annoying. So that is my snare sound for now. The next thing is to use an enveloper to further shape the sound, and what I like to do with this is boost the attack gain just a tiny bit and set the time to around 20 milliseconds or 30 milliseconds, and then I'm going to reduce the gain of the release to make the whole snare a bit tighter. And then just bring down the out level to compensate. Now at the moment that's sounding pretty good. The only problem is that it is a bit too quiet, and we are peaking at negative 0.9, but when you use this sound in your mix, you want it to punch through really clearly and have lots of presence, and at the moment this sound isn't going to do that. So to do that, what I like to use is a limiter, and the settings that I use a release time of around 40 milliseconds and the output level around minus 0.5, and then the look ahead needs to be set to 0, because when you have a look ahead, set to say 4 or 7, whatever, is the limiter will anticipate the next transient, and it will alter its effect because it's prepared for the next transient. But that's not what I want. What I want is I want to create the illusion that the start of my snare is clipping, because I want the beginning to be the loudest part, and in order to do that you need to set the look ahead to 0. Now then, what you need to do is just gradually bring up the gain until you're happy with the sound. And then that is more or less it for limiting. Now begins the resampling process, and what I like to do is bounce that in place. So now we have our snare sound converted to audio. So I'm just going to trim the beginning off so our sample begins immediately. Cut the end off, put a fade on the end, and then bounce that in place. And now I'm going to convert this to a new sample track so we have it in EXS24. Okay, so now it's in EXS24, we can further manipulate it, and we can also draw in this a MIDI pattern. So I might want something that sounds like this. And at this point you can also modulate the velocity of your snares. And you can use the features inside of EXS24 to manipulate your snare. So I might want to pitch it up, pitch it down. I can change the shape of it using envelope 2. I can make it shorter with the decay. I can filter it. And that is how I make snare drums inside of Native Instruments Massive and using resampling.